"Just kill me fast," she said. What kind of suffering forces a woman to whisper those words with nothing left but bruises and shame? What horror was hidden beneath the blanket? The kind that makes even a hardened rancher stumble back in silence. And more than that, after a life marked by cruelty, could she ever find dignity, love, and a home again? The train sighed into Dust Hollow like it had been holding its breath too long. Evening light slid along the rails, thin as a ribbon. On the platform, a woman stood wrapped in a gray blanket that had seen more winters than she had friends. Clara kept her head down, one hand clutching the edge beneath her chin, the other white-knuckled around a carpet bag that didn't weigh half as much as her shame. When a ranch hand jostled past, the blanket shifted, and a bruise along her jaw flashed and disappeared like a swallowed word. She didn't look dangerous. She looked like somebody the weather had practiced on. A tall man stepped from the shadow of the freight office, hat in hand. He didn't crowd her or clear his throat in that way men sometimes do when they want a woman to feel small. He just came close enough that his voice could be gentle without being loud. "Ma'am," he said, "you look cold." Her mouth trembled. "Just make it quick," Clara whispered. The words slid out before she could stop them, a habit formed by men who like to hear women hurry. She flinched as if bracing for the strike that usually followed asking for anything at all. The man blinked once, startled not at her face but at the ache inside the sentence. "Name's Thomas," he said, "the way you might introduce a neighbor to a neighbor. There's hot water out at my place and a stove that behaves if you talk kindly to it. Can I carry your bag?" Clara shook her head. The carpet bag stayed in her grip as if parting with it might drop her memories all over the platform. A gust of high country wind worried the blanket. Thomas didn't reach for it, didn't touch her. "I won't lay a hand on you unless you ask me to," he said, "but I am going to ask you to let me help." For a long moment, the only movement was the lantern flame wobbling in the station master's window. Then Clara exhaled a thin, tired sound and nodded. They moved toward the buckboard. When Thomas set the carpet bag on the plank seat, the blanket slipped lower. Clara grabbed for it too late. On her wrist, a circle of skin shone a different color, like a ring made of old fire. Above it, raw grooves where rope had learned the shape of her. Thomas went still. His breath changed, quiet but deep, and he took a step back, not away from her, but away from the hurt, as if refusing to rush it. "I'm sorry," he said softly. The apology wasn't for seeing, it was for what had been done. Clara tried to tuck the blanket higher. A folded scrap of paper fell from the lining and fluttered against her boot. Thomas picked it up and read without a sound. A bill of sale. For a human being. It was stained with a thumbprint the color of rust. He looked like a man who had just watched lightning strike a church. He folded the paper once, twice, until it was small enough to put in his vest. "This doesn't belong to you anymore," he said. "I'm not clean," Clara murmured. The words weren't about dirt. They were about worth. "Ma'am," Thomas replied, steady as a fence post. "You're not a floor that can be tracked over. You're a person." He nodded toward the road out of town. "You're coming with me." There was no swagger in it, no claiming. It sounded like a man offering a lantern to a traveler and pointing out the safer path. They rode in the soft rattle of twilight. Sage and dust mingled in the air, like two old songs finding the same tune. The sky kept sliding from copper to violet. Clara sat straight, the blanket gathered under her chin, eyes on the line where land met night. Every so often, the wheels hit a rut, and she caught her breath the way people do when they're not sure if they're allowed to make a sound. Halfway to the ranch, Thomas slowed the team and reached under the seat. He brought out a chipped blue enamel cup and a small tin of tea. "This belongs to anyone who needs it," he said, careful not to look at her wrist again. He poured and steam lifted like a blessing that didn't need a church to be holy. The cup warmed Clara's hands before it warmed her mouth. She let the blanket loosen an inch. At the crest of the last rise, the house came into view, a square of lamplight on the prairie, simple as a promise that doesn't brag. Thomas pulled the team to a stop and looked at her without taking measure. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "Door doesn't lock because you won't need it. Only rule at my table is we don't talk to one another the way the wind talks to fence wire." Clara swallowed. She'd learned to live in places where rules sounded like traps. This one sounded like a hand held open. Behind them, the dark gathered into its usual shape. Ahead, the lamplight widened. Clara tightened the blanket once more. then let it fall just enough to taste the night air on her throat. If the blanket came all the way down, what would the world see more horror or the first small corner of hope? The buckboard rattled down the slope until the prairie flattened into a quiet yard, half shadow, half lantern glow. The house stood plain and square, its boards weathered by more winters than its walls should have borne. A chicken coop leaned tiredly against the barn. Smoke slipped out the chimney in ribbons, as if even fire knew better than to roar in this place. Clara stepped down carefully. The blanket clung to her shoulders, though her fingers shook with weariness. She braced for the bark of command she had grown used to, but none came. Thomas only moved to the porch, held the door, and said, "Inside's warmer." The kitchen smelled of cornbread long gone cold and wood smoke clinging to beams. It was no palace, but it wasn't cruel either. Clara stood in the doorway, still clutching her bag like it was a shield. "You can set that down," Thomas said. His voice was steady, not pressing. "It won't walk off." But Clara didn't. She had lived through rooms where setting something down meant never seeing it again. So she held on. Thomas nodded, as though he understood without needing words, and busied himself with the stove. "I can cook," she murmured almost to herself. Her eyes dropped to the cracked floorboards. The confession sounded like an apology. "I know you can," he said simply. He poured water into the black kettle, each motion quiet as a prayer. "But tonight you don't have to." Silence pressed between them like a wall. Clara shifted her blanket, slipping just enough to expose the ragged neckline of her dress. A welt traced its way along her collarbone. Thomas froze, then looked away, not out of disgust but respect. He lit the lamp and set it where its light shone on his own hands, leaving her in a softer shadow. For the first time in years, Clara felt no eyes crawling over her scars. She sank onto a chair, still holding her bag tight, her breath uneven. The kettle began to hum. Thomas set a cup in front of her, chipped at the rim but clean. "Tea's not much, but it's hot." She cupped it with both hands, heat seeping into her bones. For a moment she let her eyes close. In the dim hush of that kitchen, she felt the strange weight of something she thought she had lost forever: safety. But safety was dangerous. It could vanish, and part of her was certain it would. She opened her eyes and whispered, "Why did you bring me here?" Thomas leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Because no one should have to walk out of that station alone." The words landed heavier than he intended. She looked at him, searching for the catch, the demand, the price that always came after kindness. But there was none. Only a man standing steady in his own skin. Her throat ached. The tea trembled in her hand. Out on the prairie, coyotes cried into the night, sharp reminders of how easily the world could wound. Inside the house, the lamp burned low, holding its small circle of light like a vow. And for the first time, Clara wondered, could she live inside that circle, even for a while? The question hovered between them, unanswered, but alive. Would this fragile shelter become a home, or another place that would one day turn her out? The night passed slow, each tick of the mantel clock echoing like a hammer in Clara's chest. She lay awake on the narrow cot in the corner of the parlor, blanket pulled to her chin, eyes fixed on the slanted ceiling. The wood creaked, the wind brushed against the shutters, but no heavy footsteps came, no door thrown open, no voice demanding she get up and work until her bones screamed. Still, her body remembered. Every muscle stiffened at each sound, waiting for a blow that never fell. At dawn, the smell of frying bacon pulled her from a restless half-sleep. She sat up, clutching the edges of her shawl, blinking at the morning light spilling across the room. Thomas stood at the stove, his sleeves rolled, moving with quiet ease. "I should have risen earlier," she said quickly, guilt pressing at her words. "I can. You'll have time to work," he cut in gently, not unkind. "But today you'll eat first." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even persuasion. Just a statement, as if eating were a right she needn't earn. The words startled her more than a shout would have. As she sat at the table, hands wrapped tight in her lap, she noticed a Bible resting by the window. Its cover was worn edges, frayed from years of use. The sight of it sent a twist through her stomach. Scripture had been the lash of her father's tongue, the tool he used to justify every humiliation. "Obedience is holiness," he would thunder, while shaving her head for vanity, while reminding her no man would ever love a blemished woman. She looked away, but the old lies clung. "You don't know what I've been," she whispered before she could stop herself. Thomas glanced at her fork, paused midair. His gaze wasn't prying, only steady. I don't need to. You're here now. That's enough. Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but scars had long memories. After breakfast, he led her outside. The land stretched wide, rolling into the horizon raw and quiet. A few calves bawled from the pen, and the air smelled of sage and damp earth. This place, he said, gesturing to the worn fence line and the acres beyond. It's too much for one man. Always has been. She followed his gaze, saw the weight in his shoulders. A loneliness different from hers, but kin all the same. Something inside her shifted, subtle as the morning breeze. For years she had been treated as a burden, something to discard. Here was a man saying without words that she might be part of the answer, not the problem. But fear was quick to rise. What happens when he sees all of me? The scars beneath her dress, the shame carved into her skin, the story she never dared to tell. The thought silenced her. Her heart rattled against her ribs, not from hope, but from dread. And yet, as the prairie sun climbed higher, she felt a question stir inside, fragile and trembling. Could this land, this man, this silence be the place where her story began again? The answer lingered out of reach, waiting in the shadows of her past. The days settled into a rhythm, though Clara moved through them, like a ghost unsure of her right to stay. She rose early, swept the porch, tended the chickens, and mended torn shirts with hands that shook less each morning. Yet beneath her calm exterior, the weight of hidden scars pressed harder than ever. Every night she folded her dress neatly by the cot, wrapping herself in long sleeves even when the summer heat pressed down heavy. She knew the marks beneath the burns, the jagged lines from whips and cruel hands, would speak stories she could not bear to retell. She had lived her entire life believing her body to be proof of her unworthiness. Thomas never asked questions she couldn't answer. He simply gave her space, offering small kindnesses, a cup of coffee, left steaming on the porch rail, a coat draped over her shoulders when the night grew cold, silence. When silence was all she had to give. Still, Clara felt the divide between them. She saw the way he paused sometimes, as though holding back words. She wondered if pity rested behind his eyes, or worse, if curiosity would one day drive him to peel away the shield she had lived behind for decades. That night a storm rolled across the prairie. Rain battered the tin roof, wind moaned against the walls. Lightning flashed, and for a moment the room was as bright as day. Clara startled, clutching her shawl to her chest. The storm felt too much like the nights she'd hidden from fists and fire. In the darkness that followed, she heard Thomas's voice. Low, steady. You don't have to be afraid here. She almost laughed, a broken, bitter sound, but stopped herself. Instead, she whispered, You don't know what I am. The words hung heavy between them, heavier than the storm outside. She waited for his reply, for anger or dismissal, for the inevitable, turning away. But Thomas only said, You're someone standing in front of me now. That's all I need to know. Tears stung Clara's eyes, though she blinked them back. No man had ever spoken to her like that, with no demand, no condition. But a part of her, carved deep by years of cruelty, still feared what would happen if he ever saw. As thunder rolled across the sky, Clara pressed her palm to the windowpane, heart aching with both fear and a fragile flicker of hope. Could she really stay in this place with this man, without her past breaking her apart? For the first time in decades, she wanted to believe the answer might be yes. But the cloth, the veil of her silence, still stood between them. And she knew the day was coming when it could no longer stay. The days after the storm were strangely quiet. Clara busied herself in the kitchen, stirring broth, baking bread, and sewing patches into the knees of work trousers. To anyone looking in, she might have seemed like a woman settling into a new home. But inside, she was unraveling thread by thread. Every glance from Thomas felt like a question she couldn't answer. He never pressed, never asked more than she could give, but the gentleness itself tore at her. It was easier to endure cruelty than kindness. Cruelty she understood. Kindness was a language she had long forgotten how to speak. One evening, while clearing supper, Clara's sleeve slipped up past her elbow. The jagged line of an old scar flashed in the lamplight. Thomas saw it, his hand stilled on the table, and his breath caught not with disgust, but with something softer, almost sorrow. Clara froze, panic flooding her chest. In an instant, she dropped the plates, the clatter echoing through the cabin. Don't look at me, she whispered, her voice breaking. She stumbled back, clutching her arm, as though the fabric could erase what he'd seen. Please, don't. The silence that followed was unbearable. Clara's heart raced, her shame clawing at her throat. She waited for Thomas to speak, to demand answers, to push her away, to say the words she had always expected: damaged, ruined, unclean. But Thomas only rose slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He picked up the broken plate from the floor and set it aside without a word. Then he said softly, "Clara's scars don't scare me. They only tell me you've survived things most couldn't." She shook her head violently, tears spilling. "You don't know. You don't know what was done to me, what I let happen. I'm not clean anymore." Her words trembled in the air, more fragile than the glass shards at her feet. It was the first time she had spoken them aloud, the truth she had carried in silence for decades. Thomas stepped closer but stopped short of touching her. His voice was steady, almost reverent. "Then let me be the one who reminds you, you don't need to be clean to be worthy. You just need to be you." Clara crumpled onto the chair, burying her face in her hands. For the first time in years, she wept openly, not hidden behind cloth, not muffled by silence, but raw and trembling in the presence of another soul who did not turn away. It was unbearable. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And in that moment, she realized something she had never dared believe before. Perhaps her scars did not have to be the end of her story. But could she truly let someone love her as she was broken, marked, and all? The days that followed Clara's breaking open were unlike anything she had ever known. It was as though the prairie itself had shifted, subtle, quiet, but undeniable. The winter sky seemed less harsh, the light through the cabin windows a little warmer. And though the scars still traced her skin like branded shadows of her past, they did not scream quite as loudly. Yet with the softness came fear. Every morning, Clara woke before the rooster's crow, slipping her apron over her shoulders, kneading bread, tending to the fire, all while her mind wrestled with the same question: can I let this man see me? All of me. Thomas never demanded, never pressed. He moved around her with a kind of reverence, as though she were both fragile glass and unyielding stone. He repaired the broken fence line, brought water from the well, and quietly set small comforts on the table: an apple, a sprig of sage, a new mug carved from wood. At times the quiet was unbearable. She had known cruelty, yes, but she had never known such patience. It unnerved her. It made her ache. One evening the wind howled so fiercely that the shutters banged against the cabin walls. Clara was mending a blanket by the fire when Thomas stepped inside, his shoulders dusted with snow, his face pale with exhaustion. "Fence gave out again," he muttered, lowering himself onto the chair across from her. His hands trembled slightly as he rubbed the cold from them. Clara hesitated, then set down her sewing. For a long time she simply watched him, his weathered hands, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by worry. Something in her chest shifted. Without a word, she rose and fetched a basin of warm water. She set it before him, rolled up her sleeves, and gently took his hands into hers. Thomas stilled his eyes, lifting to hers with surprise. "Clara." "Shh," she whispered, dipping his hands into the water, her touch slow, deliberate. She washed away the dirt, the splinters, the ache of the storm. It was a simple act, one she had performed countless times for others in another life. But this time it was different. This time her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something tender, something dangerous, something like love. When she finished, Thomas didn't pull away. He kept her hands cradled in his rough fingers, brushing against her scarred skin. "You don't have to hide from me," he said softly. "Not anymore." Clara's breath caught. Her first instinct was to retreat, to yank her hands back, to let the shadows close in around her again. But she didn't. Instead, she let his words linger like embers, warming her from the inside out. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake on her cot in the corner, staring at the rafters above, the crackle of the dying fire keeping her company. Memories rose unbidden: the cold floor of her childhood home, where she had knelt in punishment, the sneers of her husband who had treated her body as something to be used and discarded, the nights she had wrapped herself in cloth, so no one would ever see the shame carved into her flesh. Tears slid down her cheeks as she whispered into the darkness, "I'm so tired of hiding." From across the cabin she heard Thomas stir. For a moment she thought he was asleep, But then his voice broke the silence, low and steady. Then stop. Her breath hitched. She turned her head, and through the dim firelight, she saw him watching her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a quiet strength that steadied her trembling. You've carried more than any person should, he said. But Clara, you don't have to carry it alone. Not anymore. Her heart pounded. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not as though she was weak, not as though she was ruined, but as though she was worth standing beside. The next morning, Clara did something she had not done in years. She walked outside without her kerchief. The cold air bit against her skin, and the sunlight fell across the marks on her face, marks she had always thought would make the world recoil. For a moment, panic surged through her. She expected the ranch hands nearby to stare to whisper, but none did. They tipped their hats, politely went on with their work, and the world did not end. Thomas was waiting by the fence, hammer in hand. When his eyes met hers, they widened slightly, not in horror, but in something like awe. He stepped closer, slowly, carefully, until he was near enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath in the icy air. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Clara froze, the words striking her harder than any insult ever had. Her instinct was to laugh bitterly, to dismiss it as pity. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no falsehood, no condescension. Only truth. Her throat tightened, and for once she didn't argue. The days turned into weeks, and with them, Clara began to unravel the chains she had bound herself in. She laughed, hesitant at first, then freer, as she watched Thomas trip over a stray bucket or pretend not to notice the twins sneaking biscuits from the kitchen. She sang softly while she cooked, her voice rusty but caring, filling the cabin with a music that felt like home. And at night, when the silence grew heavy, she let herself rest in the knowledge that she was no longer invisible. Still, the old voices whispered. There were moments when she caught her reflection in the wash basin, and flinched moments when she recoiled from Thomas's touch, out of habit rather than distrust. Healing, she realized, was not a single act, but 1,000 small choices made day after day. One evening, as they stood together on the porch watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, Clara whispered, "Do you really think someone like me deserves this?" Thomas turned, his gaze steady. "Clara, you're not here because of what you deserve. You're here because you're needed, because you're wanted, and that's worth more than anything." Her chest tightened, her eyes filling with tears she no longer feared. For the first time in her life, she began to believe him. The prairie wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of spring. And with each passing day, Clara stepped more fully into the light, not as the woman who hid behind cloth and scars, but as a woman who dared to be seen. The chains had not disappeared, but they were looser now, slipping away piece by piece, leaving room for something she had thought forever lost, hope. And yet, deep in her heart, one question remained. Could she truly let herself be loved fully and without fear? The morning broke, soft, pale light spilling across the Wyoming prairie. The long winter was giving way to the first blush of spring, and the frost that had clung to everything, fences, windows, hearts, was finally loosening. Clara stood at the threshold of the cabin, her apron folded neatly in her hands, watching the sun lift itself over the horizon. For years, mornings had been a weight. They had carried with them dread routine born of survival and the constant ache of scars hidden beneath cloth. But this morning felt different. Something had shifted in her chest, subtle yet undeniable, like the way a frozen river begins to murmur once more when spring comes. Behind her, the sound of laughter startled her out of her reverie. Thomas was at the table, struggling to corral the twins into eating porridge instead of feeding it to the barn cat that prowled hopefully around their feet. Their giggles filled the room like birdsong, high and unburdened. Clara's lips tugged into a smile before she could stop them. And it was in that quiet moment that she realized something. She was no longer standing outside of life, watching it happen to other people. She was inside it, living, breathing, belonging. The journey to this place had not been smooth. The days had tested her, pushing her back into corners, where shame whispered its cruel reminders. At times, Clara had nearly retreated. There were nights she clutched her blanket, wondering if Thomas would someday see the ugliness she still believed lived inside her and decide to walk away. But he never did. Instead, Thomas met her hesitations with gentleness. He didn't try to erase her scars or pretend they weren't there. He simply walked beside them as though they were part of the road that had led her to him. And the more he stayed, the more Clara began to believe she wasn't defined by the worst of what had been done to her. One evening, after a long day mending fences, Thomas found her by the creek. She was rinsing laundry, her sleeves rolled up, the water glinting with the last light of the sun. He paused, watching her in silence, as though he were memorizing the way she stood, the way the light softened the lines of her face. When she finally looked up, startled by his presence, he spoke in a voice that carried both steadiness and awe. "You don't know, do you?" Clara frowned. "Know what?" He stepped closer, squatting down beside the water so his eyes met hers. "That you've brought life back to this place. To me. To those girls. To yourself." Her throat tightened. "I'm not sure I've done anything worth saying that." Thomas shook his head. "You breathe, Clara. You show up. You care. That's more than enough. That's everything." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. For the first time, she let him see them, let him see her. The following week, the matchmaker who had first urged Thomas to seek a wife came riding into town. Clara overheard whispers at the mercantile. "He finally found one poor man, but look at her, old, worn, scarred. What's he thinking?" The words stung, but they did not pierce as deeply as they once might have. Clara carried them home like small pebbles in her pocket, not heavy enough to break her, just reminders of the path she had traveled. That evening, while Thomas rocked the twins on the porch, Clara sat beside him. The air was cool, the stars just beginning to blink awake. She turned to him and said quietly, "People think you settled, that you took what no one else wanted." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "No, Clara. I didn't settle. I chose. And I'd choose you again every day in front of every person who doubts it." Something in her chest cracked open, then not with pain, but with release. The shame she had carried like a second skin seemed at last to begin peeling away. The next Sunday, the little church in town was full. Neighbors whispered as Clara entered, her back straighter than it had been in years, her hands no longer clutching cloth to hide her face. Thomas walked beside her, steady as an oak, the twins skipping just ahead. During the service, Clara found herself weeping, not the quiet tears of despair, but the trembling tears of someone who had been lost and was now found. She wasn't sure what people saw when they looked at her. Perhaps they still saw scars or age or a woman who didn't fit the mold of beauty, but none of it mattered anymore, because she knew with absolute certainty that she had a place. Later that night, when the twins were asleep, Clara stepped outside to find Thomas leaning against the fence staring at the stars. She joined him, the silence between them, comfortable now, full instead of empty. "I was afraid," she confessed, her voice low, "that the cloth would always define me, that the scars would always tell my story." Thomas turned to her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Scars don't tell the story, Clara. You do. And the story you're writing now, it's beautiful." Her heart clenched, then loosened as if years of holding her breath had finally ended. She let out a shaky laugh and wiped her cheeks. "You always know what to say." "No," he replied. "I just know the truth when I see it." And there, under the vast Wyoming sky, Clara made her choice. She stepped closer, reached for his hand, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel the need to apologize for existing. She didn't flinch when his fingers closed around hers, steady and sure. She whispered, almost in disbelief, "I feel clean." Thomas smiled gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You always were. You just needed someone to remind you." The stars shimmered above them, the prairie stretched wide and unbroken, and Clara realized that hope had not been a cruel dream after all. It had been waiting for her to believe she was worthy of it. From that night forward, life was still hard. The fences still broke, storms still came, and grief still visited from time to time. But now Clara met each day not as a woman defined by the past, but as a woman who had survived it and chosen love despite it. She was no longer the one who whispered, "Please don't look at me." She was the one who stood tall, scars and all, and dared to be seen. And in being seen, she had found everything she once thought she'd lost: dignity, family love, and the quiet, steady hope of belonging. Out on the frontier, scars are easy to see on the land, on a man's hands, on a woman's face. But the deepest scars are the ones carried quietly in the heart. Clara's story reminds us that even when life has broken us down to whispers of Just kill me fast. There can still be a hand willing to lift us up, a voice steady enough to say, "You're not finished yet." Her journey shows us something simple yet profound. Dignity is not given by others, but revealed when someone chooses to stay to see us fully and to love us as we are. And perhaps that is the gift hidden in all of our trials, that no matter what cruelty we have endured, we can still arrive at a place of healing gentleness and quiet belonging. For each of us, there are days when we feel invisible or unworthy. But Clara's story is a lantern in the dark, reminding us that no wound is too deep, no shame too heavy for love to reach us. What matters most is not perfection, but presence. Someone staying, someone believing. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to None Wild West Saga for more tales of courage, tenderness, and second chances. Share this story with someone who needs hope and tell us in the comments, would you like to see what happens next in Clara's life? Or hear another story of late blooming love and redemption? Because sometimes the next story might just be your own.